I found my daughter slumped against the steering wheel of her car on Penetang Road. The windshield caved in, her door crumpled like a tin can. The November rain was coming down in sheets, and she was barely conscious when I pulled her out. She wasn't alone on that road by accident. Someone had run her off it deliberately. With what little breath she had left, she grabbed my sleeve and whispered, "Dad." It was Marcus's father. He said people like us don't belong in his family's world. He said we never will. The fury that rose in my chest that night was the kind I hadn't felt since I buried her mother 12 years ago. Douglas Hargrove had always looked through me at family dinners like I was a smudge on the window. Now he'd hurt my child. He thought that was the end of it. He had no idea it was only the beginning. Have you ever been looked down on by someone who believed their money made them untouchable? Leave a comment below and tell me what city or province you're watching from. I'd love to know your stories of standing up for what's right. The call came just after 6 in the evening, when I was in the kitchen of my house in Midland, warming up leftover soup and listening to the CBC radio weather report. An Ontario provincial police officer told me they'd found a young woman in a vehicle off Penetang Road, about 15 kilometers south of town. When he said my daughter's name, I knocked the pot clean off the stove and didn't stop to clean it up. I drove through the rain with my hazards on the whole way, my hands tight on the wheel, my mind running to the worst places a father's mind can go. Midland was the kind of small Georgian bay town where people still left their screen doors unlocked in summer, where the harbor filled up with sailboats in July, and the Tim Hortons on King Street was the morning meeting point for half the retired population, including me. It was not the kind of place where you expected someone to deliberately force your daughter's car off the road. I was wrong about that. My daughter had always been the kind of person who made things beautiful. Ever since she was small, she'd been in the kitchen beside her mother, learning to put up preserves, peach jam in August, wild blueberry in September, crabapple jelly from the tree in our backyard that her mother had planted the year she was born. When her mother passed, my daughter took that knowledge and turned it into something real. She called the business Shoreline Kitchen, started selling at the Midland Farmers Market on Saturdays, then at a few independent grocers around Simcoe County. 3 years ago, a buyer from Loblaws tried one of her jars at the Barrie location of a small chain she'd gotten into, and within a month they were talking about a provincial distribution deal. The contract was worth close to $2 million over 3 years. My daughter had built that from nothing except her mother's recipes and her own stubbornness. She had also, along the way, fallen in love with Marcus Hargrove, whose father owned Hargrove Property Holdings, the largest private real estate developer between Barrie and Sudbury. Douglas Hargrove had built shopping plazas, bought up waterfront parcels, and had his name on the donor walls of every hospital and minor hockey rink in the county. He sat on the boards of 3 community foundations. He had lunch with MPPs. He believed, in the way that certain men do, that his success gave him a kind of authority over everyone around him. He had never, not once in the 4 years my daughter and Marcus had been together, treated her like she was worth his attention. At Christmas dinners, he talked over her. At their engagement party at the family's house on Honey Harbor Road, he told Marcus within my earshot that he hoped the boy wasn't making a mistake. I said nothing. I told myself it was my daughter's life to live. I should have said something then. When I got to the hospital, my daughter was being assessed for a concussion and a fractured wrist. The police told me a transport truck driver had spotted her car in the ditch and called it in. There were no witnesses to the actual collision. No one had stopped. I sat in a plastic chair outside the examination room until a nurse came to get me, and I held my daughter's hand while she told me what had happened. She had gone to meet Douglas that afternoon at his office on 2nd Street. She had not told me about the meeting beforehand. She knew I would have insisted on coming. Douglas had called her in on the pretense of discussing the wedding, which was planned for the following June. Instead, he had sat her down across a desk the size of a dining table and told her that he had done some looking into Shoreline Kitchen, that he understood the Loblaws agreement was close to being finalized, and that he had a proposal. He wanted 60% of the business transferred to a numbered company he controlled, in exchange for what he called introductions to his network and the use of Hargrove Holdings' legal team for the distribution contract. He said it so calmly that it took her a moment to understand what she was hearing. When she said no, He set down his pen very carefully and told her that people with her background tended to find the commercial food industry more complicated than they expected. That retailers sometimes reconsidered supplier relationships when questions were raised about a company's ownership history or liability exposure. He said he had some concerns he'd been meaning to bring to the attention of the Loblaw's regional buyer. She told him the meeting was over and walked out. 40 minutes later, a black pickup truck came up fast behind her on Penetang Road, hit her from behind, and drove her into the ditch. She had not seen the plate. She had not seen the driver. But she had seen, as she was leaving Douglas's building, a black pickup parked directly in front with the engine running, and a man inside she didn't recognize watching the entrance. I barely slept that night. I lay in the dark in my house and thought about what kind of man does what Douglas Hargrove had done. Not just a bully, not just a snob, a man who calculates, a man who plans. By the time the light started coming through the curtains, I knew I couldn't do this alone. I called my old friend Frank at 7 in the morning. Frank had spent 28 years with the OPP, the last 12 as a detective sergeant in Aurelia, before he retired to his property outside Penetang. He was 68 years old, moved slower than he used to, and still kept a notebook in his shirt pocket out of habit. When I told him what happened, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Drive over. Now." I sat at Frank's kitchen table while he made coffee, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, only writing occasionally. When I finished, he put down his pen. "This man is not a businessman who lost his temper," Frank said. "The way you're describing it, the meeting, the truck waiting outside, the timing, that's organized. That's a pattern of behavior." He looked at me steadily, and patterns leave traces. He opened his laptop, something I'd always found slightly incongruous given that he'd spent most of his career writing longhand in notebooks, and started working through public records, corporate registry filings, court records, property transaction histories. He had old colleagues who owed him calls returned. By noon, we had a picture of Douglas Hargrove that made the coffee go cold in my hands. Over the past 11 years, 4 small business owners in Simcoe County and the District of Muskoka had sold assets to numbered companies connected to Hargrove Holdings at prices significantly below assessed value, in each case within months of documented disputes with Hargrove or his associates. A woman who ran a marina supply business in Penetang had sold her waterfront property for 40 cents on the dollar after a fire of undetermined cause destroyed her storage building. A man who operated a small construction firm in Gravenhurst had withdrawn a competing bid on a municipal contract and closed his business within 6 months of a workplace safety complaint that was later dismissed as unfounded. A couple in Bracebridge had sold their inn after the wife's sudden health crisis and subsequent medical bills made carrying the mortgage impossible. Frank turned the screen toward me. "He doesn't just want your daughter's business," he said. "He takes things. That's what he does. He finds leverage, or he creates it, and he takes things." He met my eyes. "And right now, your daughter is his problem." My daughter was released from the hospital the following morning. I brought her to my house on Little Lake Drive and set her up in her old room, her wrist in a splint, her face pale against the pillow. Marcus came that evening, and I could see in him a confusion that I recognized as genuine. He loved my daughter. He was not his father. But he had grown up in his father's house, and he was still finding out what that meant. 2 days after the accident, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Marcus's sister. I had met her only a handful of times at family events. She was 34, lived in Toronto, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm. She had always been careful at those gatherings, watchful in the way that people are when they've learned to be. She told me she had heard what happened to my daughter. She said she had been waiting for a reason to do something she'd been afraid to do for a long time. She asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. We met the following afternoon at a coffee shop in Barrie, far enough from Midland that neither of us was likely to be seen by anyone who mattered. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back corner with a tea she hadn't touched. She looked like someone who had rehearsed what she wanted to say and was afraid she'd forget it. She told me that she had watched her father operate her entire life. She had worked briefly for Hargrove Holdings during a summer in her early 20s and had seen things she told herself were normal. Payments to consultants who provided no visible service. Contracts altered after the fact. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She had left and told herself that if she stayed away from the business, it was not her problem to solve. Then she heard that a black pickup registered to a property management company connected to Hargrove Holdings had been brought into a body shop in Wasaga Beach 2 days after my daughter's accident with front-end damage. She had photographs. She had taken them herself from the parking lot of the body shop where a man she'd grown up with worked as a mechanic and had called her when the truck came in because he'd heard about the accident on the local Facebook group and thought it was a strange coincidence. I sat very still and looked at what she had on her phone. The damage was consistent. The registration on the work order visible in one photograph matched a numbered company Frank had already flagged. I asked her if she was willing to go further. She said she had been waiting for someone to ask. She also told me something else. She had, during her time at the company, kept copies of certain documents, not for any immediate purpose, just because something in her had known, even then, that they might matter someday. Financial records showing transfers to individuals in exchange for services described only as community relations. Correspondence in which her father discussed legal challenges he intended to bring against a competitor to drain their resources, whether they were founded or not. One email, written in the cold and specific language of a man who had never expected to be read, in which he described my daughter's business as a small nuisance to be resolved before the wedding complicated matters. Frank, when I showed him everything that evening, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a full minute. Then he picked up his phone and called someone he had worked with for 15 years, a woman who was now with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit in Barrie. He told her he had something worth her time. She told him she'd meet us in the morning. The plan took 4 days to put together carefully. The RCMP investigator, a precise and unhurried woman who said very little and remembered everything, reviewed the documents, the photographs, and Marcus's sister's account. She told us they had enough to open a formal investigation, but that an investigation alone, given Hargrove's resources and the lawyers he would retain, could take years and still not result in charges that stuck. What would make it airtight was a recorded conversation. That was where Victor came in. Victor was a man in his late 50s who had managed procurement and contractor relations for Hargrove Holdings for 9 years before leaving abruptly 18 months earlier. Frank had found his name in the public records during his initial research, connected to one of the contract irregularities. It took 2 days to locate him, living quietly in a rented house in Collingwood, working part-time at a hardware store, clearly a man who had put something behind him. Frank drove down alone to speak with him first. He called me that evening and said the man was ready to talk. Not from courage, Frank said, from the same thing that moves most people in the end. He has a daughter, too, a little girl, and he doesn't want to be the kind of man she grows up understanding him to be. Victor had records on his personal hard drive going back years. He had kept them the way Marcus's sister had kept her documents, without knowing exactly why, only knowing that someday the weight of carrying them without doing anything might become heavier than the risk of acting. He had correspondence, transaction records, and 3 audio recordings he had made himself during meetings where he had been instructed to do things he was not willing to do without some form of protection. One recording was of Douglas Hargrove, clear and unhurried, discussing how to structure a payment to a municipal planning official in exchange for an accelerated approval on a waterfront rezoning application. The RCMP investigator listened to it twice and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We have enough to move." The location chosen for the final stage was the community hall on King Street, a plain brick building that had hosted minor hockey banquets and Legion dinners for 60 years. The RCMP wired it thoroughly in a single afternoon. Victor agreed to contact Douglas under the pretense of wanting to negotiate his return to the company, claiming he had heard rumors of an internal audit and was concerned about his own exposure. Douglas's assistant called back within 3 hours to confirm a meeting. The man's arrogance was breathtaking in its consistency. I sat in a car across the street with Frank and the RCMP investigator and her partner, listening through a receiver to Victor's earpiece. Marcus's sister was in a separate vehicle 2 blocks away. My daughter was at my house, her wrist still in the splint, watching everything on a shared phone call that I kept open in my breast pocket. Douglas arrived 7 minutes late, which Frank said was a power habit. We watched him walk from his Cadillac to the community hall entrance in his wool coat, hands in his pockets, the stride of a man who had never once believed that any room he walked into would not bend to him. Victor had been well prepared. He asked about the investigation, expressed his anxiety carefully, and then, with the discipline of a man who had spent years managing difficult situations, guided the conversation exactly where it needed to go. He asked Douglas about the numbered company and the truck. He asked about my daughter. He asked about the Loblaws contract and what the plan had been. Douglas talked, not carelessly, not stupidly, but with the measured confidence of a man who believed he was speaking to someone who was already compromised, already part of it, already in the same position he was in. He confirmed the truck. He confirmed what he had wanted from my daughter. He described the Loblaws buyer and a conversation he intended to have with him once the current situation was resolved. He used no names, no explicit verbs, but he was clear in the way that experienced men are clear when they believe no one else is listening. He said that some problems, when they were handled quickly and without sentimentality, had a way of disappearing entirely. He said that my daughter would make a sensible decision about the business once she had some time to understand her options clearly. Then the door opened. 3 RCMP officers in plain clothes entered first, followed by 2 in uniform. Douglas turned from his chair slowly, the way a man does when he is deciding which version of himself to present. When he saw their jackets and the recorder the lead officer was holding, he understood in a single moment the full scope of what had happened to him. He looked at Victor. Then he straightened up and said nothing. He was smart enough to know that the talking was over. The lead officer read him his rights in both official languages. Douglas Hargrove said he would be speaking with his lawyer and nothing else. He was walked out of that community hall in handcuffs while 2 people who worked at the hardware store across the street watched from the doorway without fully understanding what they were seeing. I called my daughter. I told her it was done. She was quiet for a long moment, and then I heard her exhale, the long, slow exhale of someone who has been holding their breath for a week without knowing it. Marcus was with her. He had been with her most of the past 4 days, sleeping on my couch, saying very little, doing the things that needed doing. He drove her to her follow-up appointment. He fixed the broken latch on my back fence that I'd been meaning to get to since September. He was working out, quietly and with some pain, what kind of son he was willing to be, and what kind of man he wanted to become instead. I did not envy him that process, but I respected it. The charges took 6 weeks to be formally laid. Dangerous operation of a motor vehicle causing bodily harm, criminal harassment, fraud over $5,000. Breach of trust in connection with the municipal planning matter on the recording. Conspiracy to extort. The list was long enough that it took the Crown Attorney several minutes to read it aloud in the Barrie courthouse. Victor received a conditional sentence and community service in exchange for his cooperation. He moved back to Midland, where his sister lived, and began rebuilding something that resembled a quiet life. Marcus's sister sat in the 3rd row of the courtroom every day of the preliminary hearing with her hands folded in her lap, and when Douglas looked at her once across the room, she did not look away. I thought about what that had cost her to develop, that stillness, and I hoped someday it would cost her less. The Loblaws agreement was finalized the February after the arrest. My daughter signed the distribution contract from a chair at our kitchen table with her wrist not quite fully healed, Marcus beside her, and me making coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Shoreline Kitchen would be in 800 Loblaws and Real Canadian Superstore locations across Ontario and into the western provinces by the following autumn. The peach jam and the wild blueberry, her mother's recipes. On a Saturday in early June, I stood in the backyard of my house on Little Lake Drive and watched my daughter marry Marcus in the afternoon light. It was a small ceremony. 20 people, maybe 25. Frank came with his wife and stood near the back and looked quietly satisfied in the way that a man looks when something has come out right. Victor attended because my daughter had invited him personally, and he stood to one side for most of the afternoon looking like he was still not sure he deserved to be there. My daughter wore a dress that had been her mother's idea years before her mother got sick, a sketch she had found in a journal and given to a seamstress in Barrie. She walked from the back door across the lawn alone, because she wanted to, because she said that she had learned that she was capable of walking toward good things by herself, and she knew it now. Marcus's vows were simple. He said that he was sorry it had taken him so long to understand the difference between a family name and a family. He said he intended to spend his life understanding the difference better. My daughter's vows made me have to look away for a moment. She talked about her mother, about preserves in August, about how her mother used to say that the point of putting things up for winter was not to have them for yourself, but to have something to give. She said that was still what she believed. She said she intended to give a great deal. After dinner, when the guests were scattered through the yard, and the light was getting long over Georgian Bay in the distance, my daughter found me by the garden bed where I'd planted the crabapple sapling from our old tree the spring her mother died. She leaned her head against my shoulder. She said there was something she and Marcus wanted to tell me. I already knew, in the way that you know certain things before they're said, when your child carries a particular kind of light. She said there would be a baby in the spring. I stood there in my backyard in the June light holding my daughter, and I thought about her mother, and about the tree, and about the jam that would be on shelves across Ontario in a few months with a label that had her mother's handwriting on it. And I thought that the world is full of men like Douglas Hargrove, men who believe that enough money gives them the right to take anything from anyone. What they never understand is what they're up against. They are not up against the weak. They are up against the stubborn, the patient, and the people who love them. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and listened to the sound of Georgian Bay somewhere in the dark, and thought about what I would tell this grandchild, someday, about the year their mother's business almost got taken away and wasn't. I would tell them that their grandmother made jam from whatever the yard gave her, and that their mother did the same. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to believe the lie that they don't deserve what they've built. That courage is not the absence of fear. It is finishing the drive home even when your hands are shaking. It is calling your old friend at 7 in the morning because you cannot carry it alone. It is a young woman walking across a backyard toward her future in a dress that was her mother's dream. And sometimes, if you are very patient and very stubborn and very lucky, the truth finds its way out on its own, through the people who have been carrying it longest and waiting for someone to ask, "What did this family story mean to you?" Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought their power made them untouchable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that ordinary people still win sometimes. Subscribe to SR, Sweet Revenge, for more true stories of justice finding its way home.